Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to talk about my thoughts about 3 of the leading lay-flat wet and dry vacuum cleaners in the market today: the Tineco S6 Stretch, the Roborock Flexi Pro, and the Dreame H14. This is not going to be a review of these machines. I actually did a thorough and dedicated review of each of these separately. I will put links in the description should you wish to check those out, but rather my thoughts comparing all 3 and ultimately which one I would pick out of the 3. Let's find out more. So let me start with the design. And the Tineco and the Dreame, they both look like your standard run-of-the-mill wet and dry vacuum cleaner. There's nothing special about those. The Dreame in black has a nicer and more sleek design than the Tineco, but the Roborock Flexi Pro stands out of the crowd by having a very atypical, let's say, design for these, and actually a pretty nice design, which is a major upgrade from the predecessor, the Diet Pro, which I also reviewed last year, and I thought it looked horrendous. It did not look nice at all. It looked boxy, bulky. I wasn't a big fan of the design of the Diet Pro, but the Flexi Pro looks really, really nice. And to be honest, I think it's the nicest looking wet and dry vacuum cleaner that I've seen. Now, unfortunately, the nice aesthetic design does come at a price, as we lose a couple of things. So for starters, the capacity of the water tanks is less with the Flexi Pro. So on the Tineco, you have an 850 milliliter clean tank and a 720 milliliter dirty tank. On the Dreame, 880 milliliters and 650 for the dirty. On the Roborock, it's 730 milliliters for the clean water tank and 450 milliliters for the dirty. So that is significantly smaller than the others and also than the predecessor. Nice design also impacts the clearance level. So as you know, these have lay flat ability, so they can lay flat at 180 degrees and go under furniture. The Roborock, because of its design, limits a little bit the clearance level. I measured that at 14 centimeters versus 13.5 centimeters for the Dreame, and the Tineco has the lowest clearance level at 12.5 centimeters. However, despite those design concessions, the Flexi Pro makes up for that with the battery life by having the highest rated battery life of the bunch at 50 minutes versus 40 minutes for the Tineco and 35 minutes for the Dreame H14. Now, in terms of cleaning, they all did a fairly similar job at cleaning. They're all really good at their cleaning performance, and you can watch the cleaning tests of each of these in the dedicated review that I made. One difference, however, is in the modes that they have. So they all have auto mode, which relies on a sensor to kick the machine into higher power and higher water dispensed when it detects any stubborn stains. The problem with that mode is that you're relying on that sensor, which I found was not very responsive or accurate, and sometimes it doesn't kick the machine into higher mode at all. This is where a max mode comes in handy, where you can manually kick the machine into the highest power. That's going to give you the highest suction, but also a faster spinning of the brush, and more importantly, more water and solution dispensed. The Tineco has max mode, the Roborock has max mode. The Dreame H14, for some reason, they removed the max mode. So you can only have the machine on auto mode. And as I said, the sensor doesn't always detect when there's more dirt or grime or stains on the floor. And there's no way for you to kick the machine into high power, which is one of the main issues I have with the Dreame, as I think this mode is quite important to have. Another difference is the floor suction or floor drying mode, which you would use to dry the floor or suck any water there without dispensing water to the brush roll. The Tineco and the Dreame both have that. And now, this time around, for some reason, Roborock decided to remove it from the Flexi Pro, although they had it on the Diet Pro, the predecessor. So again, I'm not sure why these companies are deciding to remove essential modes, but in this category, I would give the point to the Tineco, as it has all the modes that I think are useful: the auto mode, the maximum mode, but also the floor suction mode. And there's also a DIY mode, which you can customize in the app if you wanted to. Roborock and the Dreame both are missing one mode, but if I had to pick between the two, I would definitely pick the Roborock, as that one has the max mode, but not the floor suction mode. And I think between the two, it's far more important to have the max mode than the floor suction mode. Now let's talk about maneuvering these machines and ease of use. They're all kind of assisted. That is, pushing the machine around is easy because they are self-propelled. However, the Roborock is the only one that actually has self-propelled wheels, and those are bidirectional. So if you push the machine forward or if you pull it backwards, the wheels are going to help you in both directions by propelling the machine. The Dreame and the Tineco do not have self-propelled wheels, but are themselves somewhat self-propelled, and that's because the rotating brush is going to help you push the machine forward, making it easier to move it around. Now, off the bunch, the point definitely goes to the Roborock because of those bi-directional wheels. It does make maneuvering the machine much easier, both pushing it but also pulling it back. With the others, it's still easy to move the machine around, but the assistance is somewhat less, and you also don't get any assistance when you're pulling the machine backwards. So the Roborock wins in maneuverability, but also, in my opinion, has the best head pivot of the bunch as well, where I feel the cleaning head pivots the most out of the bunch and is the easiest to move around. In second place, I would pick the Tineco S6, which I felt is really easy as well to maneuver, despite not having the bi-directional assisted wheels. The head does not pivot as much as the Roborock, but it's still very easy to move around, probably also assisted by the fact that it's the lightest one, weight-wise, of the bunch. In third place, I would pick the Dreame H14. It's not annoying to push it around, but when you test it back-to-back with the Roborock or with the Tineco and the Tineco are both superior in maneuverability than the Dreame. I did feel it's a bit heavy, the head does not pivot a lot, and despite the self-propulsion, the assistance of the rotating brush, it was, in my opinion, the worst one of the bunch in terms of how easy it is to maneuver. The Flexi Pro also has an LED headlight on the cleaning head, whereas both the Tineco and the Dreame don't, which is a nice addition, but not a massively important feature. Now let's talk about how they compare in the brush cleaning and drying process. So that's after you finish cleaning your house, putting it back on the base and cleaning the brush and drying the brush roll as well. Let's start with the Tineco. It offers 70 degrees Celsius hot water cleaning of the brush roll, which lasts for 2 minutes. Now I discovered something interesting on the Dreame. In theory, it only has one cleaning mode. However, you do have the option for the brush drying between a fast 5-minute drying of the brush roll or a silent 1-hour drying of the brush roll. And I found out that depending on which one of those two modes you choose, it has an impact on the cleaning of the brush. So if you choose the 5-minute quick drying, then the cleaning cycle lasts 5 minutes. Whereas if you choose the silent 1-hour drying of the brush roll, then the cleaning cycle only lasts 3 minutes. And I think because with the fast drying mode, you do have an extra 2 minutes of centrifugal drying, whereby the machine is spinning the brush roll at high speeds to try to wring out all the water from the brush roll, because the drying is only a quick 5-minute drying. Whereas if you pick the silent drying, and that's going to be over a full hour, then I guess Dreame realized they don't need to spend those extra 2 minutes with the centrifugal drying, because over the course of a full hour, it's going to dry the brush roll completely. On the Roborock, the cleaning session lasts 3.5 minutes. Now, I think they all did a somewhat similar job at cleaning the brush roll. I do have some reservations on the hot water aspect of the cleaning. Initially, I was under the impression that there was no hot water at all, and that's because the brush was not even warm to the touch after the cleaning session. Neither was the water that was collected in the water tank. But upon further tests, I discovered that with some of them, like the Tineco, blowing hot air, the same hot air they use for drying on the brush as it is being cleaned, which in my opinion does not really make the water hot enough for any effectiveness. On the Dreame and the Roborock, there is a heating element on the base that heats up the water that is being collected, which I could only see if I removed the brush roll in that cleaning cycle. Both the Dreame and the Roborock state they clean at 60 degrees Celsius. I found the Dreame was a bit lower than that, whereas the Roborock, I was surprised, does get close to that temperature. Now, again, I have my reservations on how effective this cleaning at hot water is versus room temperature water, but I found for the most part, they had very similar results in cleaning the brush roll. Now let's talk about the drying, and here there's a couple of differences between the three. With the Tineco, there's a 5-minute flash dry session that comes right after the cleaning session, so these are bundled together, and I found that it gets the brush dry to about 90%. If you're not happy with that result, you can kickstart another drying session that lasts 3 minutes by holding the button for 3 seconds, and after that extra 3-minute cycle, the brush was almost completely dry at about 97%, I would estimate. And that brings the total drying time to 8 minutes if you're running the extra drying mode as well. With the Dreame, you have the option between 2 modes, as I said. You have a quick mode, which lasts 5 minutes, and that got the brush to almost 95% dry, or you have a silent mode for 1 hour, and that got the brush completely dry. Here's my issue with the Dreame. There's no way to manually turn on either of these drying modes. You have to go through the brush cleaning first, and then the drying is going to be automatic after the brush cleaning. Which means, and especially if you selected the fast drying mode, you have to go through a full 5 minutes of the brush being cleaned to be able to dry the brush for 5 minutes, which I found is one, a waste of time, a waste of energy, but also sometimes I don't want to clean the brush roll, I just want to dry it. Maybe there was just some water on the floor and I dried it out. I don't really need to clean the brush roll and spend 5 minutes, which are also quite loud, and we'll get to how loud in just a second. That for me was another major blow against the Dreame H14, the fact that you cannot manually dry the brush roll. The Roborock has 55 degrees Celsius drying that lasts for 30 minutes, but in the app you can configure it to go to 60 or even 90 minutes. However, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that after only 30 minutes, the brush was completely at 100% dry. Now with the brush drying, there's another important factor, which is how loud the process actually is. Let me start off with the Tineco, and this one is loud. I measured it at 69 decibels. It is loud, especially if you're sitting with a machine in the same room or it's just in the room right next to yours. And this can be up to 10 minutes. So the first session is a 2-minute cleaning followed by a 5-minute drying. But as I said, this doesn't get the brush to 100% dry. So if you then do the second drying mode for 3 minutes, you have a total of 10 minutes at around 69 decibels, which is, I mean, depending on how often you use the machine, but not very pleasant to hear that loud sound for 10 minutes. On the Dreame, the fast drying mode, I measured at around 66 decibels, so it's a little bit less loud than the Tineco. But again, my problem with that, if you're doing the fast drying for 5 minutes, you are forced to also do the cleaning for 5 minutes, which brings again the total duration to 10 minutes. So with the fast drying, although it's only 5 minutes, you have to go through that 66 decibels for a total of 10 minutes, similar to the Tineco. If you do the silent drying, however, it gets a bit more interesting. Then your cleaning session is reduced to 3 minutes, so you only have 3 minutes at that high volume. And then the silent, which is for a full hour, is at 42 decibels, which is pretty silent. Now, if you're in the same room, you're going to hear it just slightly. However, do keep in mind it rotates the brush every 60 seconds. So there's that sound of the brush rotating for a couple of seconds every minute, but it's not bad at all. And if you have it in another room, you're not going to hear it at all. So in that regard, in talking purely about noise levels, I would prefer the Dreame over here with a silent drying, because you really have to endure 3 minutes of loud sound when it's cleaning the brush roll, and then it's almost silent for the next hour. The Roborock, 30 minutes, I measured that at 46 decibels, so it's slightly louder than the Dreame. Now, purely looking at the decibel level, it's only 4 decibels louder, but perception-wise, it is, I would say, more significantly louder than the Dreame. And that's primarily because the Roborock is constantly rotating the brush throughout those 30 minutes, rather than once every minute, like with the Dreame. And this is what makes most of the noise, not the drying itself per se, but the constantly rotating brush. Now, to be honest, if you're in the same room with it, it's a little bit annoying. If it's in another room, you can still hear it. So it's not as silent as the Dreame, but I think it's quite tolerable. So it's not really annoying, but you can just hear it going on. Of the bunch, to be honest, I would have loved if Roborock had a more silent drying option. And by the way, they did on the Diet Pro. They had a silent drying and a fast drying. So I really wish they kept those two options. I do prefer the acoustic level of the Dreame, because you really cannot hear it at all if it's in another room. But the session takes an hour versus Roborock, which takes 30 minutes, but you hear it just a little bit. If Dreame had the option to manually kickstart drying mode, I would have picked Dreame. But because you cannot start drying mode without cleaning the brush roll first, I have to pick Roborock here, followed by the Tineco, because at least you can manually dry the brush roll with a Tineco without having to clean it. And in third place, unfortunately, I would pick the Dreame. Despite loving how silent and effective the drying is, the fact that you cannot manually dry the brush roll is kind of a deal breaker for me. Now, if you're curious how much energy is consumed by these machines in the drying mode, I did measure how many watts, or rather kilowatt hours, it consumed throughout the cycle. Let's start with the Tineco, and that was about 0.065 kilowatt hours for the first 5 minutes. But if you run the second drying cycle for another 3 minutes, it brings up the total consumption to 0.1 kilowatt hours. With the Dreame, if you go with the fast drying, it's only 0.04 kilowatt hours, which is quite impressive. But if you go for the silent mode, which lasts a full hour, it's also around 0.1 kilowatt hours. And with the Roborock, it's also quite similar, over 30 minutes at 0.09 kilowatt hours. Now, lastly, in terms of how much they weigh, I measured these with a full water tank, so that is essentially the maximum they're gonna weigh at any point in time. The Tineco is 5.10 kilograms, the Dreame and the Roborock are both at 5.85 kilograms, and you actually do feel it right away that the Tineco is significantly lighter than the other two. However, because of those bidirectional assisted wheels on the Roborock, the impact of it weighing more is far less perceived. It's actually not even there in a sense, where I would pick, as I said earlier, the Roborock in terms of ease of maneuverability over the bunch. So if I want to summarize that table and pick the winner in each of the categories, it's clear that the Roborock has the most wins of the bunch. The only real negative point for me is the size of the water tanks. Everything else is forgivable in a way. So from the table, the power consumption, essentially it's better on the Dreame, but I would still pick the Roborock for the drying, and that's because you can manually kick it off and it dries it at 100%. So even in the drying category, I would pick the Roborock. In terms of the weight, also it is heavier, but because of those assisted wheels, it does make the maneuverability easier. In terms of clearance, yes, it has the least amount of clearance of the bunch, but not by a lot, especially versus the Dreame. Versus the Tineco, it is more significant. And lastly, the modes. Yes, the Tineco does have all modes, but if I was to forego one mode, I would definitely pick the floor drying mode rather than the max mode, which the Dreame lacks. So looking purely at the stats, the Roborock is a winner. Would I agree with that? And yes, I definitely would. So if I was to pick of the bunch, I would definitely pick the Roborock. It's not a perfect machine, but I think it gets most of the things that matter, at least to me. It might be different for you. It gets most of those right. I would have loved if it had slightly larger tanks, yes, and also if it had a more silent drying mode. But out of the three, I think it's the most perfect machine when you look at everything else. If I was to pick a second choice, I would go with a Tineco. I think it's a really good machine, but given the same price as the Roborock, I would go for the Roborock. And in third place is the Dreame. I think it had a lot of potential, but it's not quite there. Now, one can argue this is the H14 and not H14 Pro. I would say it's not cheap. It's priced at a Pro price point. In some markets, it's even more expensive than the Tineco and Roborock, which I cannot accept, especially when it misses some things that I think are important. The battery life could be better. I think it should definitely have a max mode, and the fact that you cannot manually dry the brush roll, I think for that price point are deal breakers for me. Now, if the Dreame was half the price of the others, then maybe I would have picked it in terms of value for money. But if I'm gonna pay that much for a machine, I expect it to be as close to perfect as possible, and the Dreame H14 unfortunately is far from being there. I'll put product links in the description, so make sure to check those out to see the price at the moment you're watching this. These are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission on some purchases at no extra cost to you. So if you do decide to purchase any of those machines, I would appreciate if you would go through the affiliate links. This would greatly help support the channel. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, make sure to drop them in the comment section below. And as always, if you liked the video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel, as this encourages me to continue producing content. Until next time, cheers.